Market's not exactly buying the rally this morning. Dow down near almost 100 points. We'll tell you who else has not been buying this rally. We'll also tell you what all those banks are doing with all that money the ECB gave them, what the election might mean, for the stock market as well. A lot of stock stuff, a lot of overseas stuff today. Good morning. It's Monday. Everybody, welcome to the Markets Hub. I am Paul Vigna. Glad to be with you. Any day I'm employed, I'm glad to be with you. And let's bring in the man who makes sure that I'm continually employed, Steve Wisniewski.
Oh, Paul. Yeah, we're happy to have you here.
Yeah,
and I'm happy to be right here with you.
Right. Let's start off. First story we're going to talk about. We're going to go to London. We're going to talk to Dave Enrich. Very interesting story on what the banks, what European banks are doing with that money, those cheap loans the ECB gave them. David, how are you?
Good. How are you?
We're doing well. So, tell us, what are the banks doing with all that cheap money the ECB lend them?
Well, we don't really know the answer to that question. What we know increasingly is bit by bit, certain banks are disclosing small amounts of what they're doing. And we know for at least a small handful of very large European banks, they're taking money from the ECB and using it to basically insulate themselves from problems coming up in their subsidiaries that they have in some of the struggling Eurozone countries like Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain. So it's a very defensive use of the money. It's not exactly what policymakers and some politicians have been hoping the banks would do in terms of using the money to lend to governments or businesses or individuals.
Did the policymakers not foresee that this was a possibility, David?
You know, I don't know what the policymakers foresaw. They certainly didn't publicly describe this as a likely scenario, and much of the talk was about, and there are two main goals of all of this ECB lending. One was to kind of avert a major funding catastrophe as banks couldn't refinance maturing debts. The secondary goal was to kind of coax banks to lend more into either to governments through buying their bonds or to customers like small businesses and individuals. This is a completely different type of financial engineering that the banks are now doing with the money, using it to basically financing their own subsidiaries so that the parent companies don't need to, which is basically trying to make sure that if those subsidiaries run into trouble or if the Eurozone were to break up, the parent companies won't be on the hook for kind of having lent a lot of their own money to the subsidiaries.
Yeah, David, should we read this as a sign that maybe some of those banks, some of those subsidiary banks were worse off than we knew? Or is this sort of something that you could just expect them to take the money and park it over there? I mean, what do you make of this?
I think it depends whom you ask. And to me, it was a little bit surprising. I mean, some of these banks have made very public shows of supporting these subsidiaries and have kind of committed themselves to sticking with them. And at least the outside people that I'm speaking with about this say that this is a kind of a surprisingly conservative, defensive posture for the banks to take, and could indicate that they are looking to jettison those businesses sooner than had been expected.
David, are there any U.S. or Asian banks that have subsidiaries in any of these countries that took advantage of the loans, meaning the subsidiaries?
That's a very good question, and we do not know the answer. There's no, well, we do know there are banks from outside the Eurozone that have done it, including almost all of the banks from the UK. What we don't know is banks like a Goldman or a JP Morgan or like a Mitsubishi or someone like that that does have a Eurozone subsidiary, and so would be authorized to borrow from it. There's been very little transparency about that, but that is definitely one of the many unknowns. Certainly, though, the bulk of this money and the majority of this money came from banks probably within the Euro, or went to banks, within the Eurozone.
David, to what degree do you expect that this actually does insulate the parent banks from the subsidiary banks in these peripheral countries? I imagine they still have an obligation, assuming they're not going to jettison them, they have an obligation to sustain them if things do get a whole lot worse.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Again, this is one of those areas that there's at least a bit of ambiguity about what the actual law is and what kind of the political or social obligations of these banks would be if push came to shove. And the most interesting example to me is Crédit Agricole, which is one of the biggest banks in France, and it has a subsidiary in Greece called Enrich, which Crédit Agricole has loaned over the years and at least 10 billion euros to this subsidiary that's been struggling. It's now trying to reduce the amount that it's loaning to Enrich. Enrich is replacing that money by going to the ECB and just borrowing directly from them. And according to the people I talk with who understand Crédit Agricole's strategy, it's part of an effort so to make it easier, basically, for Crédit Agricole to essentially sever itself, if necessary, from that subsidiary. Whether they could actually do that in a painless way if the Eurozone were to break up or if Greece were to leave the Eurozone, that's another question entirely.
All right, so we're going to leave it. Dave Enrich, thank you very much, sir. Talk to you soon.